Blood and dust clouded Rachel Morgan's vision as she cradled her husband's body in the scorched ruins of their homestead. The Apache raid had come without warning at dawn, leaving nothing but death in its wake. Her husband Thomas, her baby boy Samuel, and every single thing they'd built over 3 years of marriage gone in less than an hour. Rachel's trembling fingers closed Thomas's vacant eyes as the last embers of their cabin smoldered in the Arizona Territory heat. June 1874 had brought nothing but suffering, and at 22 she found herself utterly alone in a merciless land. "Madam," a deep voice called from behind her. "Madam, you can't stay here." Rachel didn't turn. What did it matter now? The stranger's boots crunched across the charred earth until he stood beside her. From the corner of her eye, she saw worn leather chaps, a dusty denim shirt, and the glint of a silver star pinned to a leather vest. "Deputy Marshal Wade Callahan," he said quietly. "I've been tracking that Apache war party for 2 days. I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." Rachel finally looked up, squinting through tears and the harsh sunlight. The lawman knelt beside her, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair and eyes the color of the prairie sky. His weathered face showed genuine sorrow, not merely duty. "They took everything," she whispered, her throat raw from screaming. "My husband, my baby boy." The marshal's eyes widened. "Your child. They took your child." Rachel shook her head, pointing to a small, wrapped bundle near the remains of what had been their front porch. The marshal's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. "I'm alone," Rachel said flatly. "Everything is gone." Marshal Callahan surveyed the devastation, his expression hardening. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and gently took her husband's limp hand. "What was his name?" he asked. "Thomas. Thomas Morgan," Rachel replied, surprised by the question. The marshal nodded solemnly. "Thomas Morgan," he repeated. "He tried to defend your home." "Yes," Rachel whispered. "He told me to run with Samuel, but the raiders, they circled the cabin. There was nowhere to go." Marshal Callahan stood, replacing his hat. "We need to bury them proper, Mrs. Morgan. Then I'm taking you to town." Rachel clutched her husband's shirt. "I can't leave them here." "You won't," he said firmly. "But I can't leave you here either. The Apaches might return." He paused, looking at the small bundle that contained her son. His expression softened with profound grief. "I'll carry his future like my own," the cowboy told the woman who'd lost everything. "Your husband's and your son's. Their memory won't fade while I draw breath." The strange promise, spoken with such conviction, broke through Rachel's shock. She looked up at this stern-faced lawman, this stranger making a vow she couldn't fully comprehend. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Marshal Callahan's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Because 5 years ago I lost my wife and daughter to fever. No one should face this wilderness alone with grief as their only companion." As the Arizona sun climbed higher in the sky, Marshal Callahan helped Rachel dig 2 graves beneath the lone cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the attack. They worked in silence, the rhythmic sound of shovel against earth the only requiem for the dead. When the graves were dug, the marshal helped Rachel wrap Thomas in a blanket that had escaped the flames. With gentle reverence, he lifted the tiny bundle that held Samuel. "Would you like to say some words?" he asked. Rachel's mind was blank. What could she possibly say that would honor what she'd lost? Her throat closed with unshed tears. Understanding her silence, Marshal Callahan removed his hat once more and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Lord, receive Thomas and Samuel Morgan into your keeping. They were good men, yes. Even the little one was a man in the making. They defended their home and their family with courage. May they find peace in your embrace." They stood in silence as the hot wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves. Finally, Rachel placed wildflowers on both graves' yellow and purple blooms that Samuel had loved to grab with his chubby fingers. "We should go," Marshal Callahan said gently. "Salvation's Creek is a day's ride from here. You can stay at the boarding house until you decide what to do next." Rachel looked around at the blackened ruins of her life. "I have nothing. No clothes, no money. I have spare clothes in my saddlebag. They'll be too big, but they're clean. And you don't need money where we're going. The folks in Salvation's Creek look after their own." "I'm not one of their own," Rachel said. Marshal Callahan led her to where two horses waited patiently in the shade. "You are now." He helped her mount his spare horse, a gentle mare with a white blaze down her face. As they rode away from the homestead, Rachel couldn't bear to look back. She fixed her gaze on the broad shoulders of the lawman riding ahead of her, the only fixed point in a world that had dissolved into chaos. They rode through the afternoon heat, stopping only briefly to water the horses at a small creek. Marshal Callahan was quiet but attentive, making sure Rachel drank water and ate some of the jerky he offered from his provisions. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the scrubland, Rachel finally broke the silence. "Those Apaches, are you still going after them?" The marshal's shoulders stiffened. "Yes, madam, I have to. They've raided 3 homesteads in the last month. Yours makes 4. "Then why are you taking me to town? Shouldn't you be tracking them?" He turned in his saddle to look at her. "Some things take precedence, Mrs. Morgan, even justice." Rachel considered his words. "I want to go with you." Marshal Callahan reined his horse to a stop so abruptly that Rachel nearly rode past him. "That's not possible." "Why not?" she demanded, finding a spark of emotion beyond grief for the first time since the attack. "They killed my family. I have a right to see justice done." "This isn't about rights, Mrs. Morgan. It's about survival. I'm tracking a war party through Apache territory. It's no place for a woman," she interrupted. "I've lived in this territory for 3 years, Marshal. I can shoot, I can track, and I have nothing left to lose." His blue eyes narrowed. "That's exactly why you shouldn't come. A person with nothing to lose makes reckless decisions." Rachel straightened in her saddle. "I won't be reckless, but I need to see them face consequences for what they did." "Surely you can understand that." Marshal Callahan studied her for a long moment. The setting sun cast his face in shadow, but she could sense his internal struggle. "We'll talk about it after we reach town," he finally said. "For now, we need to make camp. There's a good spot about a mile ahead with natural protection and a water source." Rachel nodded, accepting the temporary truce. As they rode toward the campsite, she found herself watching the marshal more carefully. He sat easy in the saddle with the grace of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. The silver star on his vest caught the dying sunlight, but it was the way he continuously scanned their surroundings that told her he never truly relaxed. The campsite turned out to be a small hollow protected by rock formations on 3 sides. A spring bubbled up through limestone, creating a small pool before trickling away through the rocks. "It's defensible," Marshal Callahan explained as he helped Rachel dismount. "Only one direction to watch." He efficiently set up camp, building a small fire that gave heat but minimal light. From his saddlebags, he produced the promised clean clothes, a faded blue shirt and canvas trousers. "They'll swallow you whole," he said with the first hint of a smile she'd seen from him. "But they're clean. There's a spot behind those rocks where you can change. I'll keep watch from here." Rachel took the clothes gratefully. Her dress was stiff with blood and dirt, a constant reminder of the morning's horror. Behind the rocks, she stripped it off, feeling as though she were shedding a skin. The marshal's shirt hung to her knees, and she had to roll the trousers' waistband several times to keep them from falling down. She used a length of rope from his supplies as a belt. When she returned to the fire, Marshal Callahan was brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. "Better?" he asked. Rachel nodded. "Thank you." He handed her a cup of the strong black coffee. "You should try to sleep soon. We'll reach town by midday tomorrow." Rachel sipped the bitter brew, watching the flames dance. "Why did you become a marshal?" The question seemed to surprise him. He considered it before answering. "My pa was a lawman back in Texas. Taught me that a man's worth is measured by how he protects those who can't protect themselves." He poked at the fire with a stick. "After I lost my family, the badge gave me purpose when I had none." "What were their names?" Rachel asked softly. "Your wife and daughter." "Elizabeth was my wife. My daughter was Alice. She was just 2. His voice remained steady, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "Samuel was only 8 months old." Marshal Callahan nodded. "Did he laugh a lot?" "Alice used to laugh at everything, thought the world was just made for her amusement." The unexpected question brought a painful smile to Rachel's lips. "All the time, especially when our dog would lick his toes." The memory of Samuel's gurgling laughter sent a sharp pain through her chest. "Will it ever stop hurting?" The marshal looked into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "It changes, becomes something you carry rather than something that crushes you." He set his coffee down. "You should get some sleep, Mrs. Morgan. Take my bedroll. I'll keep watch." "Rachel," she said. "Please call me Rachel. Mrs. Morgan feels like someone who died this morning." He nodded slowly. "Rachel, then. I'm Wade." Rachel settled into his bedroll, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was Wade Callahan silhouetted against the starry sky, his rifle across his knees, keeping vigil against the darkness. She dreamed of Samuel's laughter, of Thomas's arms around her, of their cabin whole and filled with light. Then the dreams twisted, becoming fire and screams and blood-soaked earth. Rachel woke with a gasp just before dawn, her heart pounding. Wade was still sitting where she'd last seen him, though he'd moved to face the eastern horizon where the first hints of daylight were appearing. "Bad dreams?" he asked without turning. Rachel sat up, pushing tangled hair from her face. "How did you know?" "You were talking in your sleep, calling for them." Embarrassed, Rachel reached for the canteen he'd left beside her. "Did you sleep at all?" "I don't need much sleep," he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were tired but alert. "We should get moving. I want to reach town before the heat gets too bad." They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and dried apple slices, then broke camp efficiently. As they rode, the landscape began to change from scrubland to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. The air grew cooler as they climbed in elevation. Salvation's Creek started as a mining town, Wade explained as they crested a ridge. "Silver mostly." When the veins played out, most folks moved on, but some stayed to ranch and farm. "It's small but decent." From their vantage point, Rachel could see the town nestled in a valley below. A single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above them and scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding countryside. "It looks peaceful," she said. "It is, mostly. Far enough from the Apache territories that we don't see many raids, close enough to Fort Bowie that we get regular patrols." Wade adjusted his hat against the strengthening sun. "The people are good. They'll help you get back on your feet." As they rode down into the valley, Rachel felt the weight of eyes upon them. By the time they reached the main street, several people had emerged from buildings to watch their arrival. Wade led them to a 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it Miller's Boarding House. A plump woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun stood on the porch, arms crossed over her apron. "Marshal Callahan," she called as they approached. "You've brought us company, I see." Wade dismounted and helped Rachel from her horse. "Mrs. Miller, this is Rachel Morgan. Her homestead was raided yesterday. She needs a place to stay." Mrs. Miller's stern expression softened as she took in Rachel's two large borrowed clothes and haunted eyes. "Of course, dear. We have a room ready." She shot Wade a questioning look. "Her husband and child didn't make it," he said quietly. Mrs. Miller's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, you poor thing." She came down the steps and took Rachel's arm. "Come inside. We'll get you settled with a hot bath and a proper meal." Rachel looked back at Wade, suddenly reluctant to leave the only familiar presence in this strange town. "I need to report to the sheriff," he said, understanding her hesitation. "I'll come check on you before I leave." "Leave?" Rachel repeated. "You're still going after them?" Wade nodded. "I have to, but I'll make sure you're settled first." Mrs. Miller gently tugged Rachel toward the house. "The marshal's a man of his word, dear. If he says he'll come back, he will. Now let's get you taken care of." The next few hours passed in a blur of kindness that Rachel found almost as overwhelming as her grief. Mrs. Miller drew her a hot bath and provided clean clothes donated by various townswomen. The boarding house cook, a Chinese man named Lin who spoke little English but smiled constantly, prepared a meal of chicken stew and fresh bread that Rachel could barely eat despite her hunger. By late afternoon, she was sitting on the boarding house porch in a borrowed dress, her damp hair braided and tied with a ribbon. The physical comforts did little to ease her inner turmoil, but she was grateful for the townspeople's efforts. Sheriff Dawson, a barrel-chested man with a magnificent mustache, had visited briefly to express his condolences and assure her that the town council would help her establish herself in Salvation's Creek if she chose to stay. "Marshal Callahan speaks highly of you," he'd said. "That means something around here." Rachel had thanked him automatically, though the thought of establishing herself seemed impossible. How could she build a new life when the foundations of her old one had been so thoroughly destroyed? The sound of boots on the porch steps drew her attention. Wade Callahan stood before her, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up since their arrival, his face freshly shaved and his clothes changed, though he still wore the same worn leather vest with its silver star. "You look better," he said. "So do you," Rachel replied. "Have you eaten?" He nodded. "At the sheriff's office. I came to tell you I'm leaving at first light tomorrow." Rachel's hands clenched in her lap. "You're still going after the Apache raiding party?" "Yes. Sheriff Dawson is sending 2 deputies with me." Wade sat in the chair beside her, placing his hat on his knee. "I've arranged for you to stay here for as long as you need. Mrs. Miller has agreed to put it on my account." "I can't accept that," Rachel protested. "You can and you will," Wade said firmly. "I told you I'd carry their future, your husband's and son's. That means making sure you're taken care of until you can stand on your own again." Rachel studied his face, trying to understand this man who felt such obligation to a stranger. "Why does it matter so much to you? You didn't know Thomas or Samuel." Wade was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "When Elizabeth and Alice died, I was in Tucson chasing a horse thief. By the time I got home, they were already buried." His voice remained steady, but Rachel saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "I never got to say goodbye. Never got to honor them properly." He turned to look at her directly. "Maybe helping you is my way of making peace with that, or maybe it's just the right thing to do. Either way, I'm asking you to accept it." Rachel nodded slowly. "On one condition." Wade raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "Take me with you tomorrow." His expression hardened. "We've already discussed this. It's too dangerous." "I'm not asking to join the fight," Rachel clarified, "but I need to see them, the men who destroyed my family. I need to look them in the eyes when justice comes." She leaned forward, her voice intense. "I'll stay back when the time comes, but I have to be there. Please, Wade." The marshal stood and paced the length of the porch. "The deputies won't like it." "I don't care what they like," Rachel said. "This isn't about them." Wade stopped pacing and faced her. "You'll follow my orders without question. If I tell you to ride back to town, you do it immediately. If I tell you to hide, you hide. Understood?" Rachel felt a surge of something like hope, not for happiness, but for closure. "Understood." Wade sighed, clearly still uncertain. "We leave at dawn, be ready." He settled his hat back on his head. "And Rachel, try to get some real sleep tonight. Where we're going, exhaustion can kill you as surely as any Apache arrow." With that sobering thought, he descended the porch steps and disappeared down the street toward the sheriff's office. Mrs. Miller emerged from the house moments later, hands on her hips. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said disapprovingly. "Are you certain this is wise, dear? Chasing after savages when you've barely had time to grieve." Rachel looked at the older woman's concerned face. "Grief will find me wherever I am, Mrs. Miller. At least this way I might find some peace as well." The boarding house keeper sighed. "Well, if you're determined, you'll need proper riding clothes. That dress won't do." She eyed Rachel critically. "My niece Judith is about your size. I'll send for some of her things, and you'll need provisions." Despite her obvious disapproval, Mrs. Miller spent the evening helping Rachel prepare. By bedtime, Rachel had sturdy riding clothes, a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun, and a small pack of provisions. "Marshal Callahan is a good man," Mrs. Miller said as she turned down Rachel's bed. "One of the best. But even he can't guarantee your safety on a mission like this." "I know," Rachel said quietly, "but I have to go." Mrs. Miller patted her shoulder. "Then God go with you, child." Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by nightmares of flames and screaming. Rachel rose before dawn, her body aching with fatigue but her mind resolved. She dressed in the borrowed riding clothes, canvas trousers, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest that fit surprisingly well, and braided her hair tightly. When she descended to the boarding house's main room, she found Wade already there, speaking quietly with Mrs. Miller. Two men in deputy badges waited outside with 4 saddled horses. Wade looked up as Rachel entered. His eyes took in her attire with approval. "You look ready." "I am," she said with more confidence than she felt. Mrs. Miller pressed a package of food into Rachel's hands. "For the journey," she said. "Be careful, dear." Outside, Wade introduced the deputies, brothers named Frank and Henry Wilson. Both were tall, lanky men with identical suspicious expressions. "Madam," Frank, the elder, acknowledged stiffly. Marshals explained the situation. "Can't say I'm happy about bringing a woman along, but he says you can ride and shoot." "I can," Rachel confirmed, "and I won't slow you down." Henry, the younger brother, looked less convinced but held his peace as he helped Rachel mount her horse, the same gentle mare she'd ridden from her homestead. "Her name's Penny," he offered. "Good trail horse, steady." Rachel patted the mare's neck. "Thank you." As the rising sun painted the eastern sky with gold and crimson, the small party rode out of Salvation's Creek. Wade led the way, followed by Rachel, with the Wilson brothers bringing up the rear. They maintained a steady pace through the morning, following the same trail Rachel and Wade had traveled the day before. By midday, they reached Rachel's destroyed homestead. She steeled herself against the wave of grief as they approached, but the sight of the twin graves beneath the cottonwood tree still sent pain lancing through her heart. Wade reined in his horse beside her. "We'll water the horses at your creek, then follow the raiders' trail from here." Rachel nodded, unable to speak as memories overwhelmed her. While the men tended to the horses, she walked to the graves and knelt between them, placing a hand on each mound of earth. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered, "so your souls can rest." When she returned to the group, Wade was crouched near the burned cabin, studying marks in the earth. "6 horses, heading east," he said to the deputies. "Same pattern as the other raids. They're making for the Dragoon Mountains." Frank Wilson spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Apache stronghold country. We might be riding into a trap, Marshal." "Maybe," Wade acknowledged. "But we're not turning back." He looked at Rachel. "Last chance to change your mind." Rachel squared her shoulders. "Let's go." They rode east through increasingly rugged terrain. Wade led them along game trails and dry creek beds. Following signs, Rachel couldn't discern a broken twig here, disturbed earth there. His tracking skills impressed her, though the deputies seemed to take them for granted. As the afternoon waned, the land began to rise toward the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. Massive rock formations jutted from the earth like the spine of some giant beast, creating a landscape of shadow and stone. "We'll make camp in that canyon," Wade decided, pointing to a narrow opening between rock walls. "It's defensible, and there's water." The canyon proved to be a small oasis. A spring bubbled from the rock face, creating a shallow pool before disappearing underground again. Cottonwood trees provided shade, and the high walls offered protection from the wind and prying eyes. Henry Wilson took charge of the horses while Frank gathered wood for a small, carefully contained fire. Wade took Rachel aside, his expression serious. "We're getting close to Apache territory," he said quietly. "From here on, we need to be extra vigilant. No unnecessary talking, no wandering off alone, even to answer nature's call. Take one of us with you." Rachel nodded. "You think they know we're following them?" "Apaches always assume they're being followed," Wade replied. "It's how they've survived, but I don't think they expect pursuit this quick or this far into their territory." They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack around the small fire as darkness fell. The Wilson brothers were quiet men, answering Rachel's few questions with monosyllables until Wade gave them a pointed look. "Mrs. Morgan's husband was killed defending their home," he said sharply. "She deserves your respect, not your silence." Frank Wilson had the grace to look abashed. "No disrespect intended, madam, just not used to female company on a mission like this." "I understand," Rachel said, "but I'm not here as female company, I'm here for justice." Henry, the younger brother, studied her with newfound interest. "You said you can shoot. What do you handle?" "My husband's Winchester," Rachel replied, "and a Colt revolver." Wade reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a holstered Colt. "This was my backup. It's yours now." Rachel accepted the weapon, checking it with practiced hands. The revolver was well maintained, its action smooth. "Thank you." "Just hope you don't need to use it," Frank muttered. They established a watch rotation for the night, with Wade taking the first shift, followed by Frank, then Henry. Rachel insisted on taking the final watch before dawn. "You need sleep as much as any of us," she argued when Wade protested. "Fine," he conceded, "but wake me at the first sign of trouble." Rachel's watch came after a night of restless sleep punctuated by nightmares. Henry shook her gently awake when the eastern sky was still pitch black. "All quiet," he reported in a whisper. "Marshal says to watch that ridge to the north. Moon's bright enough to see movement." Rachel nodded, accepting the rifle he handed her. As Henry settled into his bedroll, she positioned herself on a rock overlooking their small camp. The night was cool, the desert silence broken only by the occasional call of a night bird or the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. She found herself studying Wade's sleeping form. Even in slumber, he maintained a readiness, one hand near his holstered revolver. The moonlight silvered his features, softening the lines of care etched around his eyes and mouth. She wondered about the man he'd been before losing his family. Had he smiled more easily, laughed more freely? The eastern sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, stars fading as indigo bled into the darkness. Rachel stretched, easing the stiffness from her limbs. As she stood to wake the others, a flicker of movement on the ridge caught her attention. She froze, straining her eyes to see in the pre-dawn gloom. There a shadow moving against shadows, too large to be an animal. As her eyes adjusted, she made out the silhouette of a man, then another. Without taking her eyes from the ridge, Rachel reached down and shook Wade's shoulder. He came awake instantly, hand closing around his revolver. "Ridge," she whispered. "2 men, maybe more." Wade sat up slowly, following her gaze. His expression hardened as he spotted the figures. "Apaches," he confirmed. "Wake the others quietly." Rachel roused the Wilson brothers while Wade continued to watch the ridge. When they were all alert, he outlined the situation in hushed tones. "They're scouting, not attacking yet. Probably spotted our camp last night and waited for daylight." He checked his weapons methodically. "Frank, Henry, circle wide to the east. Rachel and I will create a distraction here. When you hear shooting, come in from their flank." The brothers nodded and slipped away like shadows, moving with the stealth of experienced frontier lawmen. Wade turned to Rachel. "Stay behind me and do exactly as I say. If things go wrong, your job is to get to the horses and ride back to Salvation's Creek." "Understood." Rachel wanted to protest, to insist she would stand and fight, but she recognized the wisdom in his orders. "Understood." They positioned themselves behind a large boulder that offered clear sightlines to the ridge while providing cover. As dawn broke fully, Rachel counted at least 5 Apache warriors moving among the rocks above them. "Are they the ones?" she whispered. Wade nodded grimly. "Same war party." "I recognized the leader's headdress." Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. These were the men who had destroyed her family, her life. They were so close she could see the paint on their faces, the weapons in their hands. Her fingers tightened around the Colt revolver. "Not yet," Wade cautioned, sensing her tension. "We wait for the brothers to get in position." The minutes stretched like hours as they watched the Apache warriors confer on the ridge. Finally, 3 of them began descending toward the canyon while 2 remained as lookouts. "Get ready," Wade murmured. He raised his rifle and took careful aim at one of the lookouts. "When I fire, target the one on the left, then get down." Rachel steadied her breathing, focusing on the warrior Wade had indicated. In that moment, all her grief and rage condensed into a single point of clarity. These men had killed Thomas. They had killed Samuel. They had burned her world to ashes. Wade's rifle cracked in the dawn stillness. Almost simultaneously, Rachel squeezed the trigger of her revolver. Both Apache lookouts fell. The 3 warriors on the slope instantly dropped for cover, returning fire that chipped stone splinters from their boulder. "Down," Wade ordered, pulling Rachel lower as bullets whined overhead. From the east came the sound of more gunfire as the Wilson brothers opened up on the Apache's flank. Caught in a crossfire, the warriors tried to retreat up the slope, but the open ground offered little cover. One Apache fell to Frank Wilson's rifle. Another took a bullet but kept moving, leaving a trail of blood on the rocks. The third, the leader with the distinctive headdress, was making for a cluster of boulders that would provide defensible position. "That's their leader," Wade said. "If he escapes, he'll bring back the entire war party." Before Rachel could respond, Wade broke cover, running in a crouch toward the eastern side of the canyon. The maneuver drew the leader's fire, allowing Frank Wilson to advance. The Apache warrior, realizing he was being flanked, changed direction abruptly, which brought him directly into Rachel's line of sight. Time seemed to slow as she raised her revolver. The warrior was no more than 30 yards away, moving fast but presenting a clear target. Rachel saw his face clearly for the first time, young, fierce, painted for war. This was the man who had led the raid on her home, who had ordered the deaths of her husband and child. Her hand was steady as she sighted down the barrel. The Apache saw her at the last moment, his eyes widening in recognition not of her specifically, but of his own mortality. Rachel squeezed the trigger. The warrior fell forward, sliding down the rocky slope in a cloud of dust. He lay still, his headdress askew, his rifle fallen from lifeless hands. Rachel lowered the revolver, a strange numbness spreading through her. She had expected to feel triumph or vindication, or at least relief. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness, as if something vital had been excised from her soul. Wade appeared at her side, his expression unreadable as he looked from her to the fallen Apache leader. "You got him," he said simply. "Yes," Rachel replied, her voice distant to her own ears. "I got him." The Wilson brothers approached, checking the bodies of the fallen warriors. 3 dead, Frank reported. 2 wounded but escaped up the ridge. Wade nodded. "They'll be back with reinforcements." "We need to move." He turned to Rachel. "Are you all right?" The question seemed to come from very far away. Was she all right? Would she ever be all right again? "I thought it would feel different," she said quietly. "I thought killing him would make the pain stop." Understanding softened Wade's weathered features. "It doesn't work that way," he said gently. "Vengeance is cold comfort, Rachel. It fills the belly but starves the soul." They gathered their belongings quickly, knowing that the escaped Apaches would return with more warriors. As they mounted their horses, Rachel cast one last look at the body of the man she'd killed. The rising sun cast long shadows across his still form, making him seem smaller in death than he had in life. "What happens now?" she asked as they rode away from the canyon. Wade glanced at her. "Now we get you safely back to Salvation's Creek. And then you start building a new life." He adjusted his hat against the morning sun. "One day at a time." They rode hard through the morning, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Dragoon Mountains. By midday, they had reached more open country where an ambush would be difficult. Wade called a brief halt to rest the horses and eat a quick meal. As they sat in the shade of a solitary mesquite tree, Rachel finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind since the firefight. "How did you do it, Wade? After Elizabeth and Alice died, how did you find the strength to go on?" The marshal was silent for so long that Rachel thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I didn't at first. I spent 6 months in a bottle, blaming myself for not being there. Then one night I got so drunk I passed out on my own front porch." He stared at the distant horizon. "When I woke up, there was a little girl standing over me, couldn't have been more than 4. She was holding a cup of water, looking at me like I was some wounded animal she'd found." Wade smiled faintly at the memory. "Turned out she was the daughter of the family that had moved into the house across the street. She asked me if I was sick and did I need help. Such innocence in her eyes." He shook his head. "I realized then that the world was still turning. Life was still happening all around me and I was missing it." "So you became a marshal again," Rachel said. "Not right away. First I got sober. Then I started helping out at the church, rebuilding things that needed fixing. Eventually, I pinned the badge back on because it gave me purpose." He looked at her directly. "You'll find your purpose too, Rachel. It won't be the same as before, but it will be yours." They remounted and continued their journey, making good time across the open plains. By late afternoon, they could see the distant outline of Salvation's Creek nestled in its valley. "We'll be there before sundown," Frank Wilson said with evident relief. They were crossing a shallow stream when Wade suddenly reined his horse to a stop, his posture alert. Rachel followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual in the rolling grassland ahead. "What is it?" she asked. "Dust," he said tersely. "Riders coming fast from the south." Now Rachel saw a distant cloud of dust moving rapidly in their direction. Her heart quickened. "Apaches? Can't tell yet." Wade turned to the Wilson brothers. "Frank, take Mrs. Morgan to that rise and keep watch. Henry with me." Frank looked unhappy about being assigned to protect Rachel rather than joining the potential fight, but he obeyed, leading her to higher ground that offered both visibility and some protection. "How many do you think?" Rachel asked as they dismounted and took position behind a rocky outcrop. Frank squinted at the approaching dust cloud. "Hard to say. 10, maybe 15 riders." He checked his rifle methodically. "If they're Apaches, we're outnumbered." Rachel felt for the revolver at her hip, taking comfort in its solid presence. Below them, Wade and Henry had positioned themselves to cover the stream crossing, using the bank as natural protection. As the riders drew closer, details became visible, the shapes of horses and men emerging from the dust. Frank's tense posture suddenly relaxed. "Cavalry," he announced with palpable relief. "U.S. Army patrol from Fort Bowie, looks like." Rachel watched as the patrol approached the stream. A lieutenant at the head of the column raised his hand in greeting as he recognized Wade. "Marshal Callahan," the officer called as he forded the stream. "Thought that might be you." Wade holstered his revolver. "Lieutenant Davis, you're a ways from Fort Bowie." "Tracking an Apache war party," the lieutenant replied. "Hit a homestead 2 days ago, then disappeared into the dragoons." "We know," Wade said grimly. "We engaged them this morning, killed 3, wounded 2 more who escaped." Lieutenant Davis looked impressed. "Just the 4 of you. You've saved us a difficult pursuit." His gaze settled on Rachel as she and Frank descended to join the group. His expression registered surprise at finding a woman among them. "This is Mrs. Rachel Morgan," Wade introduced her. "The homestead was hers. Her husband and child were killed in the raid." Understanding and respect replaced the lieutenant's surprise. He removed his hat and inclined his head. "Madam, please accept my condolences. The army should have been there to protect your family." Rachel acknowledged his words with a nod, uncertain how to respond to this formal expression of sympathy from a stranger. "Will you continue pursuit of the remaining Apaches?" Wade asked. Lieutenant Davis replaced his hat. "Affirmative. My orders are to track down this particular war party and put an end to their raids. They've killed 15 settlers in the past month." He hesitated, then added, "We're not taking prisoners, Marshal. The territorial governor's orders." Rachel saw Wade's jaw tighten at this. "They still deserve a trial, Lieutenant." "Perhaps," Davis conceded, "but that's not my decision to make." He signaled to his men. "We should move out if we want to reach the dragoons by nightfall." The cavalry patrol continued north, leaving a fresh cloud of dust in their wake. Rachel watched them go with mixed emotions. These men would ensure that the remaining raiders who had destroyed her family would face justice, or at least retribution. Yet the lieutenant's casual mention of killing rather than capturing the Apaches left her unsettled. "Is that legal?" she asked Wade as they resumed their journey toward Salvation's Creek. "Killing them without trial," Wade's expression was troubled. "Legal and right aren't always the same thing, especially out here. The Army's been given a lot of latitude in dealing with hostile tribes." He glanced at her. "Does it bother you, after what they did?" Rachel considered the question carefully. "I killed a man today," she said slowly. "I thought it would bring me peace, but it didn't. It just made me wonder what kind of person I'm becoming." Wade's eyes softened. The fact that you're asking that question tells me you're still the same person you were before, just carrying more weight now. They reached Salvation's Creek as the sun was setting, painting the small town in shades of gold and amber. People emerged from buildings to greet them, word of their return spreading quickly. Sheriff Dawson met them at the edge of town, his expression shifting from relief to concern as he took in their dusty, trail-worn appearance. "Successful mission, Marshal?" he asked. Wade dismounted wearily. "3 raiders dead, 2 wounded and fled. Army patrol is pursuing the remainder." The sheriff nodded in satisfaction before turning to Rachel. "Mrs. Morgan, the whole town's been worried about you. Mrs. Miller's been baking all day, says you'll need feeding up after your ordeal." Rachel managed a small smile at this evidence of the boarding house keeper's concern. "That's very kind of her." As they rode down the main street toward the sheriff's office, Rachel was surprised by the number of townspeople who called greetings or offered sympathetic nods. News traveled fast in small communities, and it seemed everyone knew her story. "At the boarding house, Mrs. Miller fussed over Rachel like a mother hen, insisting she bathe immediately while a hot meal was prepared. Too tired to protest, Rachel surrendered to the older woman's care, finding unexpected comfort in being looked after. Later, clean and fed, she sat on the boarding house porch watching the stars appear in the deepening twilight. The events of the past 3 days felt somehow distant, as if they had happened to someone else. Yet the hollow ache in her chest remained, a constant reminder of all she had lost. Footsteps on the porch stairs announced Wade's arrival. He'd cleaned up as well, his damp hair combed back, his face freshly shaved. He carried a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "May I join you?" he asked. Rachel nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "How are the Wilson brothers?" "Regaling everyone at the saloon with tales of our adventure," Wade said with a faint smile. "By morning, we'll have faced 50 Apache warriors instead of 5. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. Finally, Wade handed her the paper-wrapped bundle. "I thought you should have this," he said. Rachel unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a small wooden picture frame containing a daguerreotype of a woman and a little girl. The woman was pretty in a quiet way, with serious eyes and a gentle smile. The child on her lap was laughing, her face a perfect miniature of her mother's. "Elizabeth and Alice," Rachel said softly, recognizing them from Wade's descriptions. Wade nodded. "My only picture of them. I've carried it with me for 5 years." Rachel looked up in surprise. "Wade, I can't take this, it's your family." "I know their faces by heart," he said simply. "I don't need a picture to remember them, but I thought—" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I thought it might help you to know that someone else understands your loss, that you're not alone in this." The unexpected kindness of the gesture broke through the numbness that had encased Rachel's heart since the morning's violence. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "I don't know what to do now," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I killed a man today and it didn't bring Thomas or Samuel back. It didn't fix anything. I have nothing left, no home, no family, no purpose." Wade's hand covered hers, warm and calloused. "You have a future, Rachel. It's not the one you planned, but it's still yours to shape." "How?" she asked, wiping away tears with her free hand. "How do I start over when everything is gone?" "One day at a time," Wade said, echoing his words from earlier. "You find small things to live for, at first a sunrise, a good meal, helping someone who needs it. Eventually, those small things lead to bigger ones." Rachel looked down at the photograph in her lap. Elizabeth and Alice's faces smiled up at her, preserved forever in a moment of happiness. "Did you ever think about leaving, starting somewhere new where nothing reminded you of them? Wade was quiet for a moment. I did. Almost took a marshal's position in Colorado territory. But then I realized something important there part of me now. Every good thing I do because they taught me how to love. I carry them with me wherever I go. His words stirred something in Rachel's heart, not hope exactly, but perhaps the soil in which hope might eventually grow. She carefully rewrapped the photograph and tried to hand it back to him. "Keep it," Wade said gently. "At least for now. Think of it as a reminder that grief, no matter how terrible, can be survived." Rachel clutched the package to her chest, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Thank you." Wade stood, replacing his hat. "I should let you rest. It's been a long few days." "Are you leaving town?" Rachel asked, suddenly afraid of losing the one person who truly understood her pain. "Not yet," he assured her. "I need to file reports about the raid and our encounter with the war party. I'll be here for at least a week." Relief washed over her. "Good." Wade paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Good night, Rachel." "Good night, Wade." As he walked away into the gathering darkness, Rachel realized she'd spoken his given name without thinking. The formality that had existed between them, Marshal Callahan and Mrs. Morgan, had dissolved somewhere between her ruined homestead and this quiet porch. She wasn't sure what that meant, only that it felt right. The week that followed established a new rhythm to Rachel's days. Mornings were spent helping Mrs. Miller with chores around the boarding house, more to keep busy than from any real need. The older woman seemed to understand Rachel's need for occupation, and found endless small tasks for her: mending linens, helping with meals, organizing the pantry. Afternoons, Rachel often walked through the small town, familiarizing herself with its layout and people. Salvation's Creek proved to be a community that took care of its own, and Rachel found herself increasingly included in that circle. The general store owner, Mr. Finch, offered her credit until you get back on your feet. The dressmaker, a French immigrant named Madame Bouvier, insisted on making her 2 new dresses at cost. "A woman must have dignity," the dressmaker declared in her thick accent. "Good clothes make dignity possible." In the evenings, Rachel usually found herself on the boarding house porch, sometimes alone with her thoughts, sometimes in conversation with other residents. And often, Wade would join her after finishing his duties at the sheriff's office. Their conversations ranged widely from books they had read to places they had lived, from childhood memories to philosophical questions about justice and forgiveness. Rachel found herself looking forward to these quiet talks, to the way Wade listened as if her thoughts mattered, to the careful consideration he gave before speaking. 5 days after their return to Salvation's Creek, Lieutenant Davis and his cavalry patrol rode into town. They brought news that the remaining members of the Apache war party had been tracked to their camp and dealt with, as the lieutenant put it. The threat to the surrounding homesteads was considered eliminated. That evening, Wade found Rachel in her usual place on the porch. His expression was troubled as he took the seat beside her. "You heard about the Army patrol?" he asked. Rachel nodded. "Sheriff Dawson told me when I was at the general store. He seemed to think I'd be pleased." "Are you?" Wade studied her face in the fading light. "I don't know what I feel anymore," Rachel admitted. "Relief that other families might be spared what happened to mine. But not pleasure, no." She hesitated, then added, "Does that make me ungrateful?" "It makes you human," Wade said. "A decent one." He looked toward the mountains, barely visible in the gathering dusk. "This land has seen too much blood, white and Apache both. Sometimes I wonder if there will ever be peace here." "Will you stay in Arizona territory?" Rachel asked. It was a question she'd been wanting to ask for days, ever since she'd realized how much she'd come to depend on Wade's steady presence. "My commission as deputy marshal is for another year," he replied. "After that," he shrugged, "I haven't thought much beyond doing the job in front of me." Rachel gathered her courage. "And what is the job in front of you now?" Wade turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes serious in the lamplight spilling from the boarding house windows. "Right now, helping you find your way forward." The simple honesty of his answer touched Rachel deeply. "You've already done so much, more than I had any right to expect from a stranger." "We're not strangers anymore, Rachel." The quiet certainty in his voice made her heart beat faster. No, they weren't strangers. In the crucible of violence and grief, they had forged a connection that defied easy categorization. Not quite friendship, not quite something more, but undeniably real. "No," she agreed softly. "We're not." The next morning brought a surprise visitor to the boarding house. Sheriff Dawson arrived during breakfast, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, after Mrs. Miller had shown him into the parlor where Rachel was finishing her coffee. "I hope I'm not disturbing your morning." "Not at all, Sheriff," Rachel assured him. "Is something wrong?" "No, madam, quite the opposite." He twisted his hat brim between his fingers. "I've come with a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." Intrigued, Rachel gestured for him to continue. "The town council met last night," Dawson explained. "We've been discussing what might be done to help you establish yourself here, should you choose to stay in Salvation's Creek." "That's very kind," Rachel said, though the idea of establishing herself still seemed abstract, a future concern rather than an immediate need. "The schoolteacher's cottage has been standing empty since Miss Holloway left to get married last spring," the sheriff continued. "The council voted to offer it to you, rent-free for 6 months to give you time to find your feet." Rachel was stunned. "The cottage? But I'm not a schoolteacher." Sheriff Dawson smiled. "That's the second part of the proposition. Our school has been closed since Miss Holloway left. We've advertised for a new teacher, but no one suitable has applied. The council wondered if you might consider taking the position, at least temporarily." "Me?" Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "Sheriff, I have no training as a teacher. Did you have schooling yourself?" "Yes, through 8th grade in St. Louis before my family moved west. And I've always loved reading, but that's more education than most folks around here," Dawson interrupted. "The children need schooling, Mrs. Morgan, and you need a purpose. Marshal Callahan mentioned you were wondering what to do next." Rachel felt a flicker of something like interest for the first time since the raid. "You've discussed this with Wade," the sheriff nodded. "It was his suggestion, actually. Said you had a way with words that would serve the children well." Warmth spread through Rachel's chest at the thought that Wade had been considering her future, looking for ways to help her rebuild her life. "May I see the cottage?" she asked. "Of course," Dawson replied, clearly pleased by her response. "I can take you there now if you'd like." The schoolteacher's cottage proved to be a small but well-built structure adjacent to the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. It contained a tidy front room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom just large enough for a single bed and dresser, and a compact kitchen with a cast-iron stove. "It's not grand," Sheriff Dawson acknowledged as they completed the tour, "but it's solid and weather-tight." Rachel ran her hand along the simple pine mantelpiece. The cottage was indeed modest, but it was clean and welcoming in a way that reminded her of her first home with Thomas before they'd built the larger cabin that the Apaches had burned. "And the school?" she asked. Dawson led her next door to the schoolhouse, a single room with rows of battered desks facing a teacher's desk on a small raised platform. Slates hung on one wall, and a bookshelf contained a sparse collection of readers and arithmetic texts. We have about 20 children of school age in town and from the surrounding homesteads, Dawson explained. Ages 6 to 14 with varying levels of education. Some can barely read, others are quite advanced. Rachel approached the teacher's desk, trying to imagine herself standing before a room of children. The thought was daunting but not entirely unpleasant. What would be expected of me? Basic education, reading, writing, arithmetic, history. School runs from 8 to 3, Monday through Friday. The town provides the building and your cottage. Parents pay a small fee for each child, which becomes your salary. Rachel turned slowly, taking in the simple classroom. Teaching had never been her ambition, but then, she'd never really had ambitions beyond being a wife and mother. Those dreams had died with Thomas and Samuel. Perhaps this new path, unexpected as it was, might offer some measure of healing. "I'd like to think about it," she said finally. Sheriff Dawson nodded, understanding her hesitation. "Of course. The council doesn't need an answer immediately. Take a few days to consider." As they walked back toward town, Rachel's mind was already filling with questions and possibilities. Would she be a good teacher? Could she truly help these children? And was she ready to put down roots in Salvation's Creek to make it her home? By the time she reached the boarding house, she was eager to discuss the proposition with Wade. She found him on the porch, deep in conversation with a trail-dusty rider who wore the insignia of the territorial marshal's office. Wade looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Rachel," he acknowledged. "This is Deputy Marshal Taylor from Tucson." The deputy tipped his hat. "Madam." "Is something wrong?" Rachel asked, sensing tension in Wade's posture. "Not wrong," Wade said carefully. "But Deputy Taylor brings orders. I'm needed in Tombstone. There's been trouble at the silver mines, violence between the mine owners and the workers. The territorial marshal wants experienced deputies to help maintain order." Rachel felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Wade replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "First light." Deputy Taylor, sensing the undercurrents between them, excused himself tactfully. "I'll see to my horse, Marshal Callahan." "Madam." When they were alone, Rachel leaned against the porch railing, trying to process this sudden change. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. The situation in Tombstone is volatile. Could be weeks, might be months." Wade moved to stand beside her, his voice softening. "Sheriff Dawson told me he spoke to you about the teaching position." Rachel nodded, still trying to reconcile the news of Wade's imminent departure with her own tentative plans. "It was kind of you to suggest it." "It wasn't kindness," Wade said. "It was truth. You'd make a fine teacher, Rachel. You have patience and intelligence, and you care about doing things right." He hesitated, then added, "The children here need someone like you." The simple conviction in his voice steadied her. "I told the sheriff I needed time to think about it. But now you're wondering if you should stay here at all," Wade finished for her. Rachel looked up at him, surprised by his perception. "Yes, without you here, Salvation's Creek feels." She struggled to find the right word. "Less like home," Wade suggested quietly. "Yes," Rachel admitted. The realization startled her. When had this small town and this man become so important to her sense of belonging? Wade was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I can't ask you to wait for me, Rachel. That wouldn't be fair, not when your future is still so uncertain." "You're not asking," Rachel pointed out. "I'm telling you that your presence matters to me, that I've come to." She faltered, suddenly unsure of how to express feelings she was just beginning to recognize herself. Wade turned to face her fully, his blue eyes intent. "I made you a promise at your homestead. I said I'd carry the future of your family as my own. That hasn't changed because of orders to Tombstone. Rachel felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, confusion, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. "What are you saying, Wade?" He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm saying that I will come back, Rachel, and I hope you'll be here when I do." The simple declaration hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibility. Rachel looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Wade's face, so familiar now, so trusted. "I think," she said carefully, "that Salvation's Creek could use a school teacher. At least until a properly trained one can be found." The tension in Wade's shoulders eased visibly. "Is that a yes to Sheriff Dawson's proposition?" Rachel nodded. "It is. Though I'm terrified I'll be terrible at it." Wade's smile transformed his face, erasing years of care in an instant. "You won't be. You'll be exactly what those children need." His expression grew serious again. "And when I return from Tombstone, we can talk about what comes next." The phrase, "what comes next," contained worlds of meaning, questions neither of them was ready to articulate fully, hopes neither was prepared to voice aloud. But it was enough, for now, to know that there would be a next, that their paths would cross again. "I'll hold you to that, Marshal Callahan," Rachel said, managing a small smile of her own. "I'm counting on it, Mrs. Morgan." The following morning, Rachel rose before dawn to see Wade off. The boarding house was quiet as she slipped downstairs and out onto the porch, where Wade was already waiting with his saddled horse. "You didn't have to get up so early," he said, though his eyes suggested he was glad she had. "Yes, I did," Rachel replied simply. They stood in the gray pre-dawn light, suddenly awkward in this moment of parting. Wade cleared his throat. "I've left letters with Sheriff Dawson, one for the school board formally recommending you for the teaching position, and another authorizing Mrs. Miller to continue your boarding on my account until you're settled in the cottage." "Wade, that's not necessary." "It is to me," he interrupted gently. "Please, Rachel, let me do this." Rachel relented, recognizing the importance to Wade of keeping his promise. "Thank you." He nodded, satisfied, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "One more thing. A parting gift." Rachel unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a book, a well-worn copy of Tennyson's poems. She opened the cover to find an inscription. "To Rachel, may these words bring comfort and hope until we meet again. Wade." "It was Elizabeth's," Wade explained. "Poetry always gave her peace in difficult times. I thought it might do the same for you." Rachel ran her fingers over the faded inscription on the flyleaf. "To Elizabeth with love, Christmas 1867, written in what must have been Wade's younger hand." The gift of something so personal, so connected to his past, moved her deeply. "I'll treasure it," she promised, "and I'll read it often." The first light of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky as Wade mounted his horse. He looked down at Rachel, his expression a complex mixture of reluctance and resolve. "Be well, Rachel Morgan, and remember that grief isn't the end of your story, just a chapter in it." Rachel reached up to touch his hand where it rested on the saddle horn. "Ride safely, Wade Callahan. Salvation's Creek will be waiting for you." He covered her hand with his own for a brief moment, then turned his horse toward the road that would take him to Tombstone. Rachel watched until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge, then returned to the boarding house. Tennyson's poems clutched to her chest like a shield against loneliness. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Rachel prepared to assume her duties as Salvation's Creek schoolteacher. She moved into the cottage, furnishing it simply with items donated by townspeople or purchased on credit at the general store. Mrs. Miller contributed linens and kitchenware. Madame Bouvier provided curtains, and Mr. Finch from the general store delivered a rocking chair for the front room to rest in after a day of wrangling youngsters. Sheriff Dawson helped her prepare for her first day, providing the school register and explaining the curriculum his own children had studied under Miss Holloway. The town's doctor, a gruff but kindly man named Howard Perkins, donated several books from his personal library to supplement the school's meager collection. "Teachers and doctors are allies in civilization," he told Rachel, "both fighting ignorance just on different fronts." The morning of her first day as a teacher dawned clear and cool. Rachel dressed carefully in one of her new dresses, a practical blue calico that Madame Bouvier had assured her conveyed appropriate authority while remaining approachable. She arranged her hair in a simple but neat style, then walked the short distance from her cottage to the schoolhouse, arriving an hour before the children were due. The empty classroom awaited her, morning sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate the rows of desks. Rachel moved to the teacher's desk and ran her fingers over its scarred surface, wondering how many lessons had been planned there, how many young minds shaped by the words spoken from this spot. "I can do this," she whispered to herself, drawing strength from the quiet determination that had carried her through the past weeks. By 8 o'clock, the schoolhouse was filled with the sound of children's voices as 20 pupils ranging from 6 to 14 years old took their seats. They watched Rachel with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness to open friendliness. "Good morning," Rachel said, grateful that her voice remained steady. "My name is Mrs. Morgan, and I will be your teacher." A small girl in the front row raised her hand immediately. "Where's Miss Holloway?" "Miss Holloway has gotten married and moved away," Rachel explained. "I'm your new teacher." "Forever?" asked a freckle-faced boy near the back. Rachel considered the question. "For now," she answered honestly. "We'll see about forever." This pragmatic response seemed to satisfy the children. Rachel proceeded to call roll from the register, putting faces to the names Sheriff Dawson had reviewed with her. There were Wilsons and Millers and Perkinses, children of the town's established families, along with names she didn't recognize from outlying homesteads. The morning passed in a blur of assessment activities as Rachel tried to determine what each child already knew and what they needed to learn. By noon, when she dismissed them for the lunch hour, she had a clearer sense of the challenge before her and the reward. As the children scattered to eat their packed lunches in the schoolyard, Rachel sank into her chair, simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Teaching, she was discovering, demanded everything: her knowledge, her patience, her creativity, her heart. It left no room for dwelling on grief or loss. For those precious hours in the classroom, she had been fully present in a way she hadn't been since the raid. When the children returned for the afternoon session, Rachel divided them into groups based on their abilities rather than strictly by age. She set the older, more advanced students to helping the younger ones with basic reading while she worked with those who fell somewhere in between. By the time the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, Rachel was hoarse from talking and her feet ached from standing, but a sense of accomplishment warmed her from within. As the last child filed out with a shy "Goodbye, Mrs. Morgan," she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. "Not bad for a first day," she told the empty classroom. "Not perfect, certainly, but a beginning." Days became weeks as Rachel settled into her new role. The routine of school provided structure to her life, rising early to prepare lessons, teaching from 8 to 3, grading papers and planning the next day's work in the evenings. On Saturdays, she cleaned her little cottage and tended the small garden she'd started behind it. Sundays were for church and rest, often including dinner at the boarding house with Mrs. Miller and the other residents. Letters from Wade arrived sporadically, carried by stagecoach or occasional travelers passing through Tombstone. His precise handwriting detailed the situation at the mine's tents, but gradually stabilizing, and asked about her progress with the school. He never wrote anything overtly personal, yet there was warmth in his inquiries about her well-being and his descriptions of the stars over the desert that reminded him of their conversations on the boarding house porch. Rachel replied to each letter, filling pages with stories of her students' progress and the small events of town life. Like Wade, she kept a careful distance in her writing, never quite expressing how much she missed their talks or how often she thought of him in quiet moments. Yet between the lines of their correspondence, something grew, a shared language of memory and hope, of promises made and kept. October brought cooler weather and the Harvest Festival, a tradition in Salvation's Creek that Rachel embraced with unexpected enthusiasm. Her students performed recitations and songs for the town gathering, their proud parents applauding every effort regardless of quality. Rachel found herself caught up in the community's simple joy, laughing more freely than she had since before the raid. It was during the festival that Sheriff Dawson approached her with news. "Got a telegram from Marshal Callahan today," he said, handing her a folded paper. "Thought you'd want to see it." Rachel's heart quickened as she unfolded the telegram. The terse message read, "Situation resolved. Stop returning. Salvation's Creek end November. Stop Wade." "That's good news," she said, striving to keep her voice casual despite the sudden flutter in her chest. "The town has missed his presence." Sheriff Dawson's knowing smile suggested he understood exactly who had missed Wade most keenly. "Indeed it has, Mrs. Morgan. Indeed it has." November arrived with biting winds and occasional dustings of snow on the higher elevations surrounding the valley. Rachel added lessons on weather and seasons to her curriculum, using the changing landscape as a natural classroom. Her students, initially skeptical of this new teacher with her different methods, had gradually come to trust and even admire her. The youngest children now ran to greet her each morning, while the older ones showed their appreciation through increased effort in their studies. As the month progressed, Rachel found herself watching the road into town with increasing frequency. Wade's telegram had said end of November, a maddeningly imprecise time frame that left her alternatively hopeful and anxious each day. She told herself that her anticipation was natural. Wade was a friend, perhaps her closest friend in Salvation's Creek, but in her heart, she knew it was more complicated than that. The last week of November brought the first significant snowfall of the season. Rachel dismissed school early as the snow began to accumulate, ensuring that children from outlying homesteads could reach home safely before dark. She returned to her cottage, lighting the fire and settling in with grating and a cup of hot tea. As darkness fell, the snow continued, blanketing the town in hushed whiteness. Rachel lit the oil lamp on her small writing desk and opened her worn copy of Tennyson, finding comfort in the familiar verses as the wind whistled around the eaves of her cottage. A knock at the door startled her from her reading. Visitors were rare after dark, especially in such weather. Rachel set aside her book and moved cautiously to the door. "Who is it?" she called. "A very cold traveler," came the reply, the voice instantly recognizable despite being muffled by the door and the falling snow. Rachel's hands fumbled with the latch in her haste. She pulled the door open to reveal Wade Callahan, hat and shoulders dusted with snow, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Wade!" The name escaped her like a prayer. He stood on her doorstep, solid and real after months of existing only in letters and memory. His beard was fuller than when he'd left, and new lines creased the corners of his eyes, but his smile was exactly as she remembered, rare and transformative. "Hello, Rachel," he said simply. "May I come in? It's rather cold out here." "Yes, of course." She stepped back, suddenly flustered. "Please, come in. I'll build up the fire." Wade stomped snow from his boots and hung his hat and coat by the door. As Rachel added wood to the fire, she was acutely conscious of his presence filling her small front room, the scent of cold air and leather that clung to him, the quiet confidence of his movements as he warmed his hands at the flames. "I wasn't expecting you in this weather," she said, to break the silence that had fallen between them. "Wasn't expecting snow," Wade admitted. "But I'd promised to be back by the end of November, and tomorrow's the last day of the month." The fact that he'd ridden through a snowstorm to keep his promise sent warmth coursing through Rachel that had nothing to do with the fire. "You must be hungry. I don't have much, but I could make soup or—" "Rachel," Wade interrupted gently. "Stop fussing. I'm fine." He smiled at her. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too," she replied, suddenly shy. "Very good." Wade looked around the small cottage, taking in the neat simplicity of her living space, the desk with papers awaiting grading, the bookshelf filled with volumes borrowed from town residents, the quilt draped over the rocking chair by the fire. "You've made this place your own." "I have," Rachel agreed. "It's become home somehow." "And the teaching?" Wade asked, his expression suggesting the answer mattered deeply to him. Rachel smiled, thinking of her students. "Challenging, exhausting, the most rewarding work I've ever done." She gestured for him to sit in the rocking chair while she took the wooden chair from her desk. "I have 20 pupils now, from 6 families in town and 4 homesteads. They're making real progress." Wade nodded, satisfaction evident in his face. "I knew you'd be good at it." "How could you possibly have known that?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious. "I'd never taught a day in my life." "Because I watched you at your homestead after the raid," Wade said quietly. "Most people would have been paralyzed by that kind of loss, but you asked questions. You wanted to understand. You were already thinking about what came next, even in your grief." He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "Teaching isn't just about knowing things, Rachel. It's about showing others how to find their way through the unknown. You've been doing that since the day we met." The insight startled her. "I never thought of it that way." "Well, I did," Wade said simply. "That's why I suggested it to Sheriff Dawson." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional whistle of wind around the eaves. Rachel studied Wade's face in the firelight, noting the new lines of fatigue around his eyes, the slight gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. "Was it very bad in Tombstone?" she asked softly. Wade sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Bad enough. 6 men dead before we restored order. Mining disputes are the worst, desperate men on both sides and too much money at stake." He shook his head. "But that's behind us now." "And what comes next?" Rachel asked, echoing the phrase he'd used before leaving. Wade's gaze met hers, steady and clear. "That's what I've come to discuss, if you're willing." Rachel's heart quickened. "I'm willing." Wade stood and moved to the window, looking out at the falling snow for a long moment before turning back to face her. "I've been offered a new position, Sheriff of Prescott. The current sheriff is retiring next spring, and the town council wants someone with territorial marshal experience." "Prescott," Rachel repeated. The territorial capital was a larger town than Salvation's Creek, more established with greater opportunities. "That's a considerable promotion." "It would be," Wade agreed. "More stability, less time in the saddle tracking outlaws, a chance to build something lasting." He hesitated, then added softly, "A place to put down roots." The implication hung in the air between them. Rachel rose from her chair, needing to move to think. You'd be good at it. The people of Prescott would be fortunate to have you. I haven't accepted yet, Wade said. There's something I need to know first. Rachel turned to face him, sensing the weight of the moment. What's that? Wade closed the distance between them until they stood an arm's length apart. Whether you might consider coming with me. Though she had half expected this question, hearing it spoken aloud still took Rachel's breath away. To Prescott, as my wife, Wade said quietly, if you'll have me. The directness of his proposal, without preamble or flowery speech, was so characteristic of the man that Rachel felt a surge of affection. Wade, before you answer, he interrupted gently. I want you to know that I understand if it's too soon, if you need more time, or if your answer is no. Your friendship has been a gift I never expected, and I wouldn't risk losing it for anything. Rachel looked up into his earnest blue eyes, seeing both hope and fear there. Is that what you think? That I might refuse you to preserve our friendship? Wade's expression grew vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. I think that you've suffered a terrible loss, and that loving again might seem impossible. I think that Thomas and Samuel will always be part of your heart, as Elizabeth and Alice are part of mine. He took a deep breath. And I think that I've loved you since the day you insisted on coming with us to face your family's killers, not despite your grief, but because of the courage it revealed in you. The simple declaration, spoken without artifice or calculation, pierced Rachel to her core. In that moment, the pieces of her shattered life seemed to rearrange themselves, not erasing what had been but creating space for what might be. When I lost Thomas and Samuel, she said slowly, I thought I'd lost everything worth living for. You were the first person to show me that wasn't true. You kept your promise, Wade. You carried their future like your own. You helped me find a new path when I couldn't see beyond my grief. She reached out tentatively to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I'm not the same woman who buried her family 6 months ago. And loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Thomas. It honors the heart he helped me discover in myself. Wade covered her hand with his own, his eyes never leaving her face. Is that a yes, Rachel Morgan? Rachel smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest that had been absent for too long. It's a yes, Wade Callahan. I will go to Prescott with you. I will be your wife. The joy that transformed Wade's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He drew her gently into his arms, his embrace tentative at first, then firmer as she leaned into him. I never thought I'd find this again, he murmured against her hair. A chance to build a life with someone who understands both the grief and the hope. Rachel rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We'll build it together, she promised, day by day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Salvation's Creek in a blanket of pristine white. But inside Rachel's cottage, warmth and light prevailed against the gathering darkness. Two souls who had each lost everything had found in each other not replacement for what was gone, but the courage to begin again. Spring came to Prescott in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. The higher elevation meant cooler temperatures than the desert valleys, and Rachel delighted in the profusion of color after the winter's snow and gray. She stood on the porch of their new home, a modest but comfortable house on a quiet street near the center of town, watching as Wade split firewood in the side yard. Though the days were warming, the nights still held a chill that required a fire in the hearth. 3 months had passed since their wedding in Salvation's Creek's small church. It had been a simple ceremony attended by the townspeople who had become Rachel's friends and supporters during her time as their teacher. Mrs. Miller had wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing I've ever witnessed, while Sheriff Dawson had stood as Wade's best man, beaming with satisfaction at the match he claimed partial credit for arranging. The transition to Prescott had been smoother than Rachel anticipated. Wade had assumed his duties as sheriff with characteristic quiet competence, quickly earning the respect of the town council and citizens alike. Rachel had found a position at the town's established school, teaching the younger children while continuing to develop the techniques she'd begun in Salvation's Creek. Their life together was taking shape day by day, morning coffee shared before heading to their respective duties, evenings spent reading aloud or discussing the day's events, nights of tender discovery as they learned each other's hearts and bodies with equal care. Wade set aside the axe and straightened, stretching his back. He caught sight of Rachel on the porch and smiled, the simple expression still enough to quicken her pulse after months of marriage. "Admiring the view," he called. Rachel laughed. "Perhaps." "You do cut a fine figure with an axe, Sheriff Callahan." Wade gathered the split wood into his arms and carried it to the porch. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mrs. Callahan." The name still gave Rachel a small thrill each time she heard it. She had kept Morgan professionally, feeling it important to honor that part of her history. But in their private life, she was Rachel Callahan, a new identity that encompassed both who she had been and who she was becoming. As Wade stacked the wood by the door, Rachel noticed a small furrow between his brows that suggested something was on his mind. "What is it?" she asked. "You've had that look all morning." Wade's lips quirked in a rueful smile. "Can't hide much from you, can I?" "Not anymore," Rachel agreed. "Not since you taught me to read the signs." Wade leaned against the porch railing, studying her face. "I received a letter today from the Indian Agency. They've been gathering orphaned Apache children, those whose parents were killed in the military campaigns, and placing them with families willing to raise them." Rachel felt her heart skip a beat as she immediately understood where this conversation was heading. "They're asking for volunteers." Wade nodded. "The agent knows of my history as a marshal in Apache territory. He believes I'd be suitable." He hesitated. "Rachel, I know this is unexpected. I wouldn't have considered it without discussing it with you first." Rachel moved to stand beside him at the railing, looking out at their small yard and the town beyond. Prescott was growing, prospering under territorial governance. Their position here was secure, their future together promising. And yet, "A child," she said softly, testing the word. "An Apache child." Wade's expression was carefully neutral, but Rachel knew him well enough now to read the hope behind his restraint. "A boy," he said, 4 years old. His name is Natan, though the agency has been calling him Nathan." "What happened to his parents?" "His father was killed in a cavalry attack last year. His mother died of fever in the winter. He's been at the agency for 3 months." Wade's voice was steady, but his hands gripped the railing tightly. "The agent says he's bright but withdrawn. Understandably so." Rachel closed her eyes, imagining this child uprooted, bereaved, surrounded by the language and customs of people who had been his enemies. The parallels to her own experience were impossible to ignore. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked quietly. Rachel opened her eyes and turned to face her husband. "I'm thinking about a promise you made to me once, beside 2 fresh graves. I'll carry his future like my own, you said." She took Wade's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "Perhaps this is part of what that promise meant all along." Hope blossomed in Wade's eyes. "You'd consider it. Taking in an Apache boy, not just consider it," Rachel said, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "I think we should do it. This child needs exactly what you gave me, someone to show him that grief isn't the end of his story, just a chapter in it." Wade drew her into his arms, his embrace conveying gratitude beyond words. Rachel rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the heart that had expanded to include her grief alongside his own, and now might expand again to encompass a child from a people he had once pursued as enemies. "It won't be easy," Wade cautioned. "There will be those in town who won't understand. Then we'll help them understand," Rachel said simply. "One day at a time, one heart at a time. Isn't that what we've both been doing since we met?" Wade pressed a kiss to her forehead. "When did you get so wise, Rachel Callahan?" "I had an excellent teacher," she replied, smiling up at him. "A certain marshal who showed me that the future is built on the foundations of the past, but isn't limited by it." They stood together on the porch of their Prescott home, watching as the spring breeze stirred the new leaves on the cottonwood trees lining the street. Soon, God willing, a child's laughter might fill these rooms, not replacing the children they had lost, but honoring their memory by creating a family forged from shared grief and resilient hope. "Write to the agent," Rachel said. "Tell him we'll take Natan." Wade's arms tightened around her. "Are you certain?" Rachel thought of Thomas and Samuel, of Elizabeth and Alice, the loved ones whose absence had brought her and Wade together. She thought of the Apache leader she had killed, whose death had taught her that vengeance offered no healing. And she thought of the small boy waiting at the Indian agency, carrying losses no child should have to bear. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said. "This is the future we're meant to carry forward together."